start the second presentation by Xiaodong from University of Toronto. Xiaodong, you are muted.
Unmute. Sorry. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thanks to the organizers for including our paper in the program. So this is a joint work with Jiandong and Hong Ma at the Tsinghua University and Wang at the Shufei. So the motivation of the paper is the following. So there's a lot of attention about the China-US trade wars, and there has been some recent studies that evaluate the consequence of the trade disputes, and which have shown that the US both consumers and firms suffer, probably more for firms than consumers suffer significant losses due to the trade dispute. And yet, when we look at the start of the trade war, when we look at the tariff that imposed by Trump administration in the first wave, and we couldn't make sense of it in terms of what Trump has been talking about in terms of trade deficits, important in terms of jobs. So in other words, the tariff that imposed by the Trump administration is uncorrelated with either the employment changes or China's import penetration to the US. Okay. So the question is then, and this kind of the tariffs imposed by Trump impose losses for the US, and that there's no obvious gains, both in terms of reducing trade deficits or reducing imports from China, or in terms of employment. So the question then is, what's the motivation for the trade war? Okay. So when we look at more carefully in terms of Trump's tariffs, and it turns out actually it's highly correlated the product that impose tariffs. It's highly correlated with the products in the industry that's listed in China's Made in China 2025. So in other words, another way to think about Trump tariff is really targeting China's industrial policy. And actually, if you go back to looking at the USTR report under section 301, and actually it's talking all about industrial policy, about unfair industrial policy of China. And so it's all about strategic competitions. Right? And in fact, in the press conference that when they released the report in March 2018, so Trump and Pence were both talking about trade deficits, protecting American jobs, and so on. But the bureaucrats, the Lighthizer and Wilbur Ross, was very clear talking about the long-term strategic competition. So in fact, this is quote by Ross, which says that the very first trade dispute they initiated, not specifically for China, but for Canada, for Korea, for many other countries, about steel and aluminum. And he said that action was taken deal more or less with the president, was present. But now this action, referring to the 301, and the action against China is on intellectual property rights, deals with the future. Okay, so one of the unfair advantage they argue is about the lack of protection of intellectual property rights. But they're talking about industrial policy in general. Actually, they go beyond the Made in China 2025. In the report, they talk about many industrial policy initiatives that China had before 2015, when the Made in China 2025 was initiated. So I'm going to show more numbers about and show you that these tariffs related to China's industrial policy. But given that is as a fact, then what we want to do then is that clearly thinking about industrial policy important. And therefore, when we think about evaluating the impact of tariffs and these trade disputes, we have to have a framework that allows for industrial policy. So in the standard neoclassical trade models, like a quantitative trade model we have now, usually there's no room for industrial policy. Because if a country imposes industrial policy, usually it tends to be a welfare decreasing. And so there's no rational reason for a country to impose industrial policy. And so what we want to do then is we're going to allow for that room. And the one way to do that is introduce scale effects. So we're going to allow industry level, sector level, external return to scale. So they're going to be increasing returns at sector level. And given that, then we're going to think about the interaction between trade policy and industrial policy. So that's what this paper is about. And so we're going to first document about the industry that's listed in the MIC 2025 face higher tariffs, but also these are not random industries. They are different from other manufacturing industries. So they actually, given the literature's estimates of return to scale, they do exhibit stronger economics of scale. And also another fact, which is quantitative, not as important, but it's also a fact, is that the production tends to be more complementary in terms of the input they use. Okay, so the idea is that you have a high-tech industry which tends to use high-tech inputs and which is less substitutable by the low-tech inputs like cheap labor and so on. So that's kind of the defining feature of this high-tech industry. They have stronger return to scale and lower substitutability among its inputs. Okay. So we're going to incorporate those features into the model. Yes, yes.
Just a quick point, an additional point that reinforces the idea that, they were really targeting industries in the MIC 2025.
Yeah.
Because I was doing some work on the side, I'm doing some work thinking about looking at which US firms were, applied for exclusions from the tariffs that the Trump administration was levying on imports. And when they apply for these exclusions, right, to the USTR, they're actually asked explicitly to comment, and I'm reading it off the website, please comment on whether the particular product of concern is strategically important or related to quote unquote made in China 2025.
I see, right? I see, great.
So it's pretty explicit, at least in terms of the USTR's considerations, right? So when firms apply to them for exemptions, they are asked to declare whether it's part of MIC 2025.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so we should we should cite that as well. Yeah, so it's so I mean we I guess if we have read the report at the very beginning, we would have come to this conclusion right away. But actually we came around this roundabout. Initially we were just looking at given all the rhetorics, we were looking at the employment, looking at the trade, and couldn't find anything, couldn't make sense. And then when we read the report, we realized, that's exactly what they're talking about. But surprisingly, that most of the media discussions, they talk very little about this. So I guess one thing we want to do is just focus attention when we think about the trade wars. We really want to focus on this, about the industrial policy. Yeah, thanks. And so what we do then is, so given the motivation, so we extend the standard quantitative trade model to a la Jiandong and parallel. So you have the global value chains and model, the quantitative model, by allowing for this external return economy of scale, and we allow for some CS input linkages rather than just Cobb-Douglas IO linkages. And then we calibrate the model to 7 major economies. Mostly we don't have like 100 economies, mostly for computational reason. So we aggregate the economy into 7 major economies and 95 disaggregate industries. And then we basically calibrate the model to 2016 before the trade dispute started. Then we evaluate the quantitative effects of Trump tariff and industrial policy. So basically here, the industrial policy is something actually I would like to hear some feedback. It's because it's hard to directly measure what the industrial policy is. And so, but I'm going to talk about that. And then the trade wars. So we're going to also looking at the interaction between the industrial policy and trade policy, and look at, for example, the Nash equilibrium result. So just a preview what we have using this quantitative. Is there a question? No? Okay. So first we find that the first wave Trump tariff actually reduced the US real wage, but it does increase US welfare, mostly because they collect enough tariff revenues that more than offset the reduction in US real wage. But the effect is quite small. So the direct welfare effects for US is about 0.023, and for China is minus 0.08. So it does has a negative effect on China and a slightly positive effect on the US. And if we're taking into account all the later rounds of tariffs and including the retaliation by China, then we find that the total welfare effect for both countries lose from this trade war. And so it's minus 0.04 for China actually, and minus 0.28 for US. So minus 0.28% is actually quite close to the estimate that Feigenbaum et al. Estimated in the QJE paper. But actually our estimates suggest that the welfare loss for China is actually smaller. And in terms of industrial policy, the surprising result we find is that so we think about industrial policy as subsidies of industry that's listed in the MIC 2025. And we find subsidizing those industries actually improve US welfare. And furthermore, the higher the tariff that the Trump is imposed on these industries, and then the higher returns of subsidizing these industries. So in that sense, so on one hand, its positive result is that the subsidy will actually help US, the welfare. And so the question why they worry so much about China's subsidies. And second, by imposing tariffs, it actually increases incentive for China to subsidize these industries. Okay, and then we're looking at so that's kind of looking at taking the other countries' strategy as given and looking at unilateral policies, and that's the results we get. And if we want to look at national equilibriums, the non-cooperative equilibrium, then we find, yes, indeed, in the national equilibrium, that China will subsidize the high-tech industry, and the US will impose tariffs on both high-tech industry, impose tariffs on high-tech imports from China, and also, like what they try to do, impose taxes on exports to China for export control, as is part of the national equilibrium strategy. And in terms of, so we have we have 7 major economies. So what we find is that in all these kind of policy changes, and Brazil and India always benefits. And during this, as a result of the conflicts, and Japan always suffers. That's our main result. Okay, so in terms of literature, so I guess, I mean, just want to mention one thing. So since we talk about policy, so there has been a lot of progress in terms of quantitative trade models. But in terms of optimal policy, what's the right policy, that literature is actually quite limited. So there are 2 important papers that I should mention. One, they're looking at optimal trade policies by allowing for also in external return to scale. So the Bartolome et al. And Nashkaripur and Lugovsky. So, but what they do is they look at optimal industrial policy and trade policy when there's a full menu of trade policies. Okay, so that will help you to get some sharp characterization about what the optimal policy would be. And what we do here is we're looking at the actual trade, so we don't allow the government to have the full manual of trade policy. We're looking at the actual policy context. So import tariffs on high-tech tech industries, and maybe export controls, and then subsidy on high-tech industry. So we only look at those instruments and look at the quantitative effects of that. And also we think about this is a China-US trade war rather than a global trade war. So we don't think about tariffs on other countries, on third economies. Okay, and therefore those results from those theoretical papers does a lot apply, and therefore we need to do our own quantitative analysis here. So let me first talk about the data. So we have as mentioned, 7 economies. So we have the US, China, Japan, EU combined as a whole. We have Brazil, we have India, and then the rest of the world. Okay, so that's in total 7 economies, and 95 disaggregate industries. And so with 60 manufacturing, 1 agriculture, and the rest are in services. And trade flows are directly from the UN Comtrade 2016 data. We're going to use that as a pre-trade war equilibrium calibration. And the tariff data is just from the World Integrated Trade System, and IO linkage from the World Trade data. So these are pretty standard in the trade literature. And the tariffs are just directly from the USTR office, and the China's retaliations from the Ministry of Commerce. So let me show you the main facts that I mentioned earlier. So here we look at the share of US imports from China, share in the US imports that from China by industry, and this is a Trump tariff. So you can see that if there's anything, there's a negative correlation. So the larger China is, the more important China is in terms of US imports, and there could be actually lower tariffs on China, on the Chinese products. And so if you exclude these two industries, then you basically see there's no correlation, or very little, very close to 0 correlation. So that's in terms of imports. And here we're looking at the so-called import competition. So we over time. So this is looking at the increase in imports from China between 2000 and 2014. And this is the impact on US employment between 2000 and 2014. So these are the China shocks. And again, the Trump tariff has no correlation with the China shock. Okay, so this shows clearly that the first wave of Trump tariff is not related, or what they said about jobs and or about trade deficits, or about Chinese export to US. But what it does relate to is whether the industry is listed in the Made in China 2025 initiatives. So you can see that the Trump tariffs tends to be higher for the industry that listed in Made in China 2025, are lower for the other industries. As Darwin mentioned, so that there's a reason for that. Like, that they are quite explicit about that in terms of the consultation process.
Xiaodong?
Yeah.
Just another thing to explore, when you sort of run this through, say, a regression, right? One thing about the tariffs was that they initially, at least, tended to target intermediate inputs as opposed to final goods, because there was an intention to spare the US consumer from the direct brunt of the tariffs. And so if you can show that these correlations, whether something is on the MIC 2025 set of industries, that relationship is robust to controlling for whether you're an intermediate input as opposed to a final good, that would be an additional thing to check.
So that's right. So that's good. Yeah, we'll control for that. Yeah. So, and exactly because these tariffs are mostly on intermediate inputs, and that's why we want to kind of pay particular attention about this global value chain. So we want to have this.
Just a quick question.
Yes.
My previous experience is that after the tariff, there's not a lot of change in employment, but there's a lot of hike up in wages.
Well, in hike up wages in the US.
Yes, my previous experience researching on this in the steel protection. What I see is really the wage rate increase. Actually, they fire workers after the protection.
I see. So yeah, we haven't looked at that. We should take a look at that, right? And yes.
So finish what you're going to say, please.
So I was going to say that the one thing that's kind of confounded this is for the identification is that the Trump's fiscal policy seems to have a major effects on the labor market, and how we separate that from the trade policy. That's a tricky issue. Yeah.
So I was going to suggest that if you are going to focus on MIC 2025, would it also make sense to look at US export controls? Export controls are much more explicitly sort of formulated to block technological advancement in China.
Right.
And
That's
in a way it's probably more effective, right? So the import tariff can only reduce some payoff to Chinese exporting firms without necessarily stopping it. Whereas export control, to the extent some of the intermediate inputs come only from the US, it can be more effective. But it's part of the same package.
That's right. Yeah, that's a good suggestion. Yeah, we saw later we're going to actually allow for that reaction in the model. Yeah, but that's we should also document how the facts look like. Yeah, we know some anecdotal evidence, but we should have a systematic documentation. Yeah, thanks.
But on the import side, would you? I mean, you show lack of correlation with sectoral employment, sectoral China shock. I wonder whether it would also make sense to have information on how important U.S. market for China's overall exports in those sectors. In other words, the same tariff will be less. You penalize your consumer without doing much to Chinese producers if it's easier for China to sell elsewhere.
Right. That's a good. Yeah, good. We'll do that as well. Thanks. So these are all very good suggestions. So now we'll show the Trump tariff in different waves. So you see the maroon line here is the first wave. So you can see here the first wave is quite discriminating, right? So and it's as many as target the high-tech industries. But if you look at the later waves, they actually becomes all over the place, right? So in some sense, I mean, according to optimal tariff theories, and that what you should do is that you should the tariff they use to control for the terms of trade effects on the export side, and then you should impose a uniform import tariffs, and so that you don't distort consumers' choices, and so in that sense. This is actually closer to the optimal tariff later on. But on the other hand, I don't think that's the case because this is only the tariff on China. So the optimal tariff would say you have uniform tariff on import tariff on all countries, and that's not the case. Okay, so but so I don't have explanation of the later runs, but I think is one reason is that the Trump just want to raise the stake of the dispute and hope China will back off. That's my interpretation of the later tariffs. And this is China's tariff, and China initially also is quite strategic. It's targeting for example, agricultural products, as been discussed widely in the press. And then in reaction to Trump's increasing the tariff in many industries, China also did the same thing, kind of also raising tariffs in many more sectors as well. Yeah, so that's why we think that looking at the first wave of Trump tariff is much more revealing about the motivation for this trade war. So that's kind of, is there any other question about the motivation or the facts before I go to the model? Okay, so the model is kind of pretty standard, except that we introduced two elements. One is the economy of scale at sector level, and second is allow for CES in input-output linkages. Okay, so it's a standard multi-sector EK model. So we assume the labor is immobile across countries, but perfectly mobile across sectors. So in a way, we can kind of look at the long-term effects of these trade disputes and industrial policy. And at the sector level, so the final goods is the preference for final goods are standard Cobb Douglas preferences, and within each sector it is produced by continuum of varieties with the CS aggregation. And then at the sector level for each variety of production, so there's a scale effect. So in other words, the unit cost It depends on the wage cost, depends on intermediate input costs. So that's the input-output linkages. But it also depends on the size of the sector, which is measured by the total employment in the sector. And if psi is going to be greater or equal to 0, if psi is greater than 0, that means there's external return to scale. Okay. And also in terms of a composite intermediate input, it's aggregating the final goods from all different sectors, all the J sectors, and there as with the CS aggregation, where we allow the CV substitution to be different across sectors. Okay. And then there's also going to be the idiosyncratic productivity shocks, productivity draws by the firms that follows a free shade, I think, the standard EK model, which will allow the trade elasticity theta J to also vary across industry, across sectors. Okay. So that's the kind of the model. And the policy we're looking at, we have export trade costs that could be due to the transportation costs or other non-tariff trade barriers. And then there's also import tariffs and export tariff. And there's also industry tax or subsidy called EIJ. So the equilibrium, it's definitely straightforward. So when we solve the impact of the policies, we use the standard Decker-Eaton-Corton method, use exact head algebra to calculate the counterfactuals. Okay, so once we calibrate the model, then we can calculate the counterfactual quite straightforward. Okay. So one thing I just want to mention is that later on I show quantitative results, I'm going to do some decompositions to show the different components of the welfare effect of trade policy or industrial policy. So the real wage or the welfare here, it has a standard ACR formula, the sufficient statistic of the home share as a sufficient statistic, but also it has two extra terms here. One is the scale effects. Okay, so here if psi j is greater than 0, then there's a scale effect. So the larger the size of the economy, the higher the welfare, because the productivity increases due to the scale effects. And then there's also intermediate input effects. Okay, so this is present in Caliendo parallel, but this is not. Okay, so that's kind of the new relative to Caliendo parallel. So we're going to evaluate the actual policies that's been implemented. But I think before we do that, I think it would be good to have a benchmark and say what would be theoretically what would be the optimal policy if the government have a full manual of policy at its disposal. Okay, so if they're not constrained by any trade agreement, so they can unilaterally choose what the optimal policy is. What would they do? And actually, so the recent literature suggests actually there's actually quite robust results on industrial policy, which basically says that the industrial policy should be used as in the closed economy. You should subsidize the industries according to the return to scale. If there's no return to scale, then there should be no tax or subsidies on that industry. However, if there's increasing return to scale, then you should subsidize, and elasticity will equal to the elasticity of productivity with respect to scale. So that's so that this policy will be the same in the open and closed economy. That's a very kind of clean and robust results. And whether you think about the optimal policy for a small open economy, like the what the Batami et al. Studied, or as a large economy with input-output linkages, and the results are all the same. But this is assuming that the government also at the same time can choose the trade policies at the same time, so whatever the impact of this industrial policy on terms of trade can be offset by the optimal trade policy. So there's a question?
Clarifying question, yeah. I mean, industrial policy, the shape of industrial policy may be the same, whether you have a closed or open economy, but the level of subsidy, wouldn't that be different?
No, it will be the same. Actually, so it's actually the same. It will be So of course there's some functional form assumption. Assume the return to scale have this log linear form. So the productivity is log linear in the size, and then the subsidy will just equal to will be proportional to the size of subsidy will proportional to the elasticity of the productivity with respect to employment. And so that's actually much stronger than just the direction, but it's actually the magnitude will be also that way. But that's a big but. A big if is that if they have free choice
because I have the following intuitions. So I'm thinking about external economy of the scale is like a declining average cost, declining average cost curve. Like if I'm able to sell in a foreign market, you know, I will reach one scale. If I'm not able to sell to foreign market, I'll have another scale. Why wouldn't that not lead to a different kind of a subsidies?
You will, well, so this is, so if first you think about, well, so if you think about production, so from the production efficiency, so what you want is that you want to eliminate any externality, right? So the industrial policy is not try to getting a larger scale, but is to try to get a production efficiency. So which you want to eliminate externality effects, and to eliminate externality effects, you want a subsidy to be exactly offsetting, be equal to the elasticity of scale, so that you will be like economy without the external economy of scale. So it's just correcting that inefficiency. So you with scale, yes, your scale will be increasing if you increase more, then you have a larger, then your scale, but the scale could be inefficiently larger. So you don't. So it's not that the larger the better, and because so even in a closed economy, you don't want a subsidy to be infinite. You want to choose a subsidy to exactly offset that externality effect. So the basically the Pagelian tax that you use to correct the inefficiency, and that, so in a way it's that the subsidy will of course will affect the prices and will affect the terms of trade and so on. And so then when you look at welfare, you have taken that into account in addition to production efficiency. But if you have a forced menu of trade policies, then you can take care of those term trade-off effects through the trade policy. No, do I answer your question?
Fine, thank you.
So this is this is not our result. So this is basically the new literature, which when they look at the optimal policies in the context of the type of model we're looking at. Okay. But we are doing the quantitative exercise, so we're going to we don't allow the government to have full menu. In other words, China is not going to start to suddenly renegotiate the tariffs with all the other countries. That's not the option. So we only think about China. Same thing for the U.S. We only think about the trade policies between China and the U.S. And therefore, those theorem does not apply here. So we have to do quantitative exercise in this context. But I think that will be a good benchmark to think about how far away in the equilibrium or in actual data the policies are from the optimal policy if the government have a full menu of policies available. Okay, so before I go to kind of the quantitative exercise, so until 1, how much time I have?
You have 25 minutes.
Okay, so let me talk a little bit about kind of a simple example to get some sense about this interaction. So we start with a kind of a toy model with Cobb-Douglas utility and production function. So forget about the CS input output linkages, but we do have the input linkage by using Cobb-Douglas form. And so the two countries, think about China, US, and there's two industries, high tech and low tech. And we assume there's a positive return to scale in the high tech, and there's no economies of scale in the low tech industries. Okay, and we assume initially the symmetric trade cost, and we assume that the the shares of the high tech goods will be matched in the data. And so we start with low policy equilibrium. So so you can think about tau including both the trade natural trade barriers plus maybe the existing tariff that we already have. And then we're looking at assume the trade elasticity before, and a standard in the literature assume 10% return to scale, which were very close to the average that we're going to calibrate later in the data. So we're going to assume 10% return to scale for the high tech industries, and the high tech share of the value added is about 20%, and we're going to assume the intermediate input share is about 50%. Okay, and initially the trade cost, as per trade cost, about 120%. And so we're going to assume the North country one will be like the U.S. So it has a comparative advantage in high tech industry. And so the low tech industry has the same productivity in both countries, but China has a larger labor force in the low tech industry. Okay, so that's kind of the setup. And then we look at, in this case, suppose initially the only two instruments. So China is going to use subsidy for its high tech industry, and the US is going to impose a tariff on high tech industry as a response. So we're looking at the national equilibrium of that. So they choose that simultaneously in the national equilibrium. So in this benchmark, then we get actually even though China does not have a full menu of the trade policies, but actually the subsidy in this toy model is very close to the optimal policy that we discussed earlier. Remember, I assume the elasticity of scale is 10%, and here the subsidy is almost 10%. It's very close to 10%. And in response, US is going to have a 30% tariffs on China's high tech exports. Okay, so that's if these are the only two instruments they have. And if we change for the same model, but if we change the return to scale, for example, if it's 15%, and then China's subsidy will be also closer to 15%. So again, this is very close to the kind of the first batch policies that we discussed earlier. And then the US with a larger scale, and then the US tariff will be even higher. And then if we think about there's no return to scale, and then the subsidy much smaller. So you can see that the subsidy depends on the return to scales critically. And also we're looking at the importance of global value chains about the input-output linkages. So you remember in China is producing this high-tech intermediate input, which will be used by the US for its production. Now, if there's no intermediate input linkages, then in this case, actually China will actually subsidize more in this case. And this is the case, remember this, you deviate from the first batch policy because remember we are looking at a case of limited instruments. They don't have a full set of trade instruments. So in this case, there's both combination of the effects of correcting the inefficiency, but also maybe like what Sangjin said, you want to expand because by subsidizing more, you'll be more competitive. And so because with the global value chain, the results that will be kind of offset by the fact that many of these benefits of lower costs of your manufacturing goods in the high-tech industries will be actually enjoyed by the US firms because they are the intermediate input for the US firms. But without that, so then the benefits mostly internal, then in this case, you actually over-subsidize compared to the efficient industrial policy. Okay, so you have 16% rather than 10%. So it shows that the global value chain actually matters for both industrial policy and trade policy. And then we kind of look the same toy model. Now let's allow for a bit more instruments. So this is we allow, for example, in China's retaliation. So US imposed tariff on China, China have the subsidy, and then China also impose tariffs on imports from the US. Okay. And also, so this is just both countries use import taxes in this case, and the US only impose tariff on high-tech industries. That's what we got. So now still the subsidy is very close to 10%, like in the benchmark case. And then we'll think about allow the US to also use other tariffs and export controls so that they impose taxes on exports on high-tech industries. And indeed, they will optimally choose positive taxes on high-tech industries. And they also import tariffs on import of low-scale goods. And in the case of China, actually the export control plays a very little role. So the optimal one will very close to zero. And in this case, given that, so China, because the scale effect, you want to fully take advantage of scale effect, so it doesn't impose a lot of the tariffs on the US high-tech industry. And the reason is that because, again, this is because of the global value chain effect, because a lot of the US high-tech industries use China's intermediate input. So if you impose tariffs on that, you will actually come back to yourself because you will reduce the demand for intermediate input. And so China has much less incentive to impose tariffs on high-tech imports from China. And the US opposite, they will have incentive to impose export control, reduce exports to China. And this is also suppose politically is feasible for US, should they use industrial policy? And yes, the model says they should also have industrial policy as well. They should not only use the trade policy, they should also use the industrial policy to subsidize its high-tech industries. But probably because US is much larger in terms of high-tech industries, and as a result, if you think about this in terms of trade effects, and the subsidy will have a much larger terms of trade effects. It's like you are a big monopolist, you have a big market share, and it's already have big market share. So this, when you further reduce your costs, then you have a strongest terms of trade effects. And so therefore, that's maybe why the subsidy is much different from the 10% that we talked about. So this is kind of a toy more to get a sense about the interaction between trade policy and industrial policy. So next, we're going to calibrate the model and to the data, and then we'll look at the Lasher equivalent for the full model. Okay. So in terms of calibration, so the both for trade elasticity and scale elasticity, which is taken directly from Bartholomew et al. Okay. And so these two guys also estimate these two parameters alternatively. We did some robust analysis. The qualitative, the results are very similar if we use their parameter to calibrate our model. Okay, so because these guys estimate much larger economy of scale, so I'm just show you the return to scale between the industries. It will still be there for using the Bartholomew estimates, but the difference is much larger for these. And you can see that the industries made in China 2025 have a higher return scale than other manufacturing industries. And the difference will be small, and the overall return scale will be smaller for Bartholomew et al. And so to be conservative about the importance of industrial policy, we use Bartholomew et al. As our benchmark. Okay. Now, there's one last parameter. Yes.
You will compare with cooperative equilibrium as well? When you say efficiency, do you mean national efficiency or you mean global cooperative? You can talk about cooperative equilibrium.
Well, the global efficiency will also be like that, right? So if they have cooperative on because in the cooperative in the first pass, when you have a social plan for the global economy, then it's like a closed economy. Then your subsidy should be exactly again equal to the.
So this statement will say the pre-trade war policy configuration is not optimal.
Well, I wouldn't go that way in the sense that the reasons are because I don't know what the subsidy is pre-trade war. So that's something I'm going to come back to. So because it's difficult to measure what the subsidies are, because subsidies coming in very different form and shape. So I will show you one attempt I have, and the results shows you that those there doesn't seem to be a systematic subsidy for the MIC 2025. But that's very preliminary. So how to measure the subsidies pre-trade war? That's the open question. I don't have a good answer yet. Okay. So in that sense, I cannot say whether pre-trade war is optimal or not. So the other parameter we want to calibrate is this elasticity of substitution, but then we just use very simple demand equations to use the US data to estimate this elasticity. Okay, so that's how we calibrate, and we do find difference between the MIC 2025 and other industries. So we do have a lowest elasticity of substitution among its inputs for the high-tech industry than the low-tech industries. But I want to emphasize that this doesn't really capture what we originally thinking about. We're thinking about is that the Huawei is going to be using chips, and chips is really cannot be substituted by having so many cheap labor. And so that kind of granular, like the complementarity, I think it cannot be captured by this kind of CES. I think we probably, in order to think about that effect, we should have a much more granular model rather than at this two-digit industry level is probably too aggregate. But it's kind of captured just a little bit, but not really the fundamental problem that we face in the the non-substitutability of some inputs. Okay, so we're not there yet for that. So that's the setup, and that's the key parameters that we calibrate. Now let me show you the counterfactual exercise. Okay, so we assume that initially China did not have any industrial policy. Okay, what's the basis? There's no good basis, but let me show you one graph. So I'm doing a very simple back of the envelope calculation. What is this? So basically, if you think about the model, if you take the model literally, it's a perfect competitive model. And then if you have subsidies on firms, and then the subsidy should be equal to the ratio of total cost divided by total sales. Okay. So because it's perfect competitive firm, so we should make it zero profit. So the total cost should equal to total sales. And that difference is a subsidy. Okay, so that's what we calculate here. So we calculate total cost divided by total sales, and then minus one, that will give us a subsidy. And it turns out that there's no subsidy, it's all taxes. But of course, what matters is relative, it's not the overall level, right? It's relative across industries. So we want to see if, for example, if this red line that made in China 2025 is much closer to zero or much smaller in magnitude in tax. So negative means taxes. So if you have lower taxes than other industries, then there will be suggestion of systematic subsidy of these industries. We don't see that. So this, what I use 2015. So that's the year when they started, when the Made in China 2025 is officially publicized. And so we use 2015, the tax survey data. So we use the firm level data to calculate total cost divided by total sales, and then aggregate at the industry level. And there we couldn't find any evidence about systematic subsidy of these industries. Okay, so, but of course, estimating that there's also issue about the markups, how we control for markups, and which will also affect the cost sales ratio and so on. And so there's many other empirical issues that we have to take care of to think about the industrial. But I think this will be important research question is how to identify the subsidies. Okay, because just look at directly the subsidies explicitly. I think that's only a very small part of industrial policy. We know it could through the capital markets, through the banking loans and so on. So we want to be a more comprehensive measure of subsidy, but we don't have a good one. And from this very preliminary evidence to suggest there's no systematic subsidies, and therefore that's why we assume there's no subsidy at the beginning in 2016. Okay, and then we're going to use when we talk about made in China 2025, from now on, it's a 5% a uniform subsidy of these industries. Why is 5%? I'll show you later on. That turns out to be the optimal unilateral optimal subsidy. If taking the 2016 pre-trade war policy as given, and if China is going to decide to subsidize the industries, then that will very close to 5%. So we use that as benchmark. So then we first look at the first Trump tariffs, and also we look at the 5% subsidy on the made in China 2025 industries with the welfare effects. Okay, so first let's look at the Trump tariff. Okay, so when Trump imposed tariff, as mentioned, of course you will have a negative effect on China's welfare, and you can see the biggest impact is on the scale. It will reduce the scale of the Chinese economy. So the scale effect is important, and it also has a positive effect on the U.S. welfare. But as I mentioned at the introduction, the wage effect is actually negative. So it's the total welfare is positive, but the wage effect is negative. But importantly, the scale effect is unambiguously positive. So it does increase U.S. scale by reducing the imports of high-tech goods from China. Now let's look at the made in China 2025. So this is again starting from 2016 before trade war. If China unilaterally imposed industrial subsidies on the made in China 2025 industries, so it has positive effects on China as a big scale effects. But interestingly, it has a positive welfare effects on the U.S. And the reason is that, as Davin mentioned, most of these industries are producing intermediate inputs that's used by the U.S. firms to producing final goods. So therefore, therefore, the lower cost of these intermediate inputs actually benefits the U.S. However, what's unambiguously negative for U.S. is a reduced scale, because these are the industries with high return to scales, and it will reduce the scale of the U.S. firms. So scale effect is important. So in that sense, here we have a static equilibrium. If you want to think about dynamic equilibrium, if the scale will have an effect on the future productivity, then maybe the welfare, dynamic welfare you can see potentially to be negative. And so that's why, in a sense, and I think it's beyond the scope of this paper. I think that's what we want to do next, is think about dynamic models. So that's think about dynamic impact of this industrial policy on the U.S.
So Xiaodong, would it be also true? Is it symmetric? Like if China were able to impose unilateral tariff, you would have get a similar picture that Chinese sector with external economy will expand, leading to positive welfare at the expense of the U.S. Is it symmetric between the two countries, or there's something in the structure of the economy that make it not symmetric?
Yeah, I think not symmetric in the sense that because of these input-output linkages, right? So because they are two different, they're at different position of global value chains. So I think if China is going to impose tariff unilaterally on the U.S. high-tech industries, you will actually may have a negative effect on the scale of Chinese high-tech industries, because it will reduce the demand for intermediate input by the U.S. So I think it's not symmetric because of these input-output linkages.
So I'm not completely. Are you saying the high-tech industries mean different stuff for China and US? The Chinese high-tech products are intermediate inputs into US high-tech.
Yeah, you remember in this model we have this
so it will be nice to actually like a dig into this a little bit and show some like differences in the type of high-tech industries in the two countries.
Right.
Sure, it's not symmetric.
Yeah. And so I think about if China just want to expand the scales, it probably want to impose somehow you want to discourage like a Korea and the others who may like a Finland, right, who are potentially providing the similar intermediate input that China is providing to the world, rather than on the US.
Xiaodong,
yeah,
a quick question. So I want to know to what extent, those welfare implications, depending on, say, the magnitude of China's industrial policy. Say, suppose, my understanding is currently you assume, pre-trade war, China imposed some industrial policy, like 5% subsidy.
No. There's pre-trade war, there's no industrial policy.
No industrial policy. Okay.
And then the made in China is 5%. Yeah. But we did something, but here we have another one that's related to it. So suppose we have the Trump tariff on the MIC. So we start with 5% subsidy, and then Trump imposed tariff.
Yeah.
So that'll be like say, so yeah. So in that case, actually the effects are very similar in terms of the effects on China, and also you look at here. So the effects on both China and US are quite similar. Yeah.
I see.
Yeah. And
the global central planners solution will be to subsidize all sectors with
return to scale,
external scale economy in both countries, right?
Yes.
In the current setup.
Yes.
So in a way, the tariff subsidy combination cannot be. I mean, you said it's Nash. It is Nash. But so I'd be curious to find out that like a cooperative equilibrium will feature just subsidies, no tariff.
Right. So I guess I mean, again, if we allow the cooperative trade policies, and then we know then the global solution will be just like the per good taxes. Will be so. But if we have any restrictions on the trade policy side, then the results depend.
Xiaodong, I have another thought. So suppose China is doing something really crazy. Chinese government is not maximizing their own country's benefits. Say that they just subsidize, those industries heavily, say 20%, 30%, intentionally try to, take down the U.S. economy. So
yeah, I mean, so you have a negative effect on China. So let me show you this.
But let's forget about the, why China is doing that. It's just a.
So this is, I mean, even you can see the welfare effects even at 10%, right? So now remember, 5% is not a small number. This is 5% on sales, okay? So when you talk about 20%, 30%, that's really crazy policy, and fiscally, I think it will be a huge burden to do that. I think it's not feasible. I think physically to have that large subsidies.
Yeah, but the question is, what will happen to the U.S. economy? So how much of welfare losses will be generated by this kind of suiciding, industrial policy?
I see. Right. So you say that maybe this effect on U.S. is also nonlinear. So as China start to expand more, maybe that the negative effects will outweigh the benefits through the reduction in intermediate input costs. And that's good.
I would think about combining Zhang Jing's and Michael's comments. Right now, it feels like that with Biden's policy, it feels like that there is really a competing to offer subsidies within your own country. And we do not know whether it's for welfare maximization or there would be strategic intent. So I think you combine the Zhang Jing's and Michael's questions to add some session. It would be really quite exciting, because so that we can see a bit about what is to come.
Yeah. So yeah. Thanks. Yeah. So yeah. So I mean, so Zhang Jing's question is about a global welfare, right? So
no, what I mean is the following. Zhang Jing's question is really about the policy is we need to give subsidies anywhere to industries with the scale. And Michael's go beyond that. It's not just about, I mean, the Zhangjing's point is really about welfare optimization. Michael's point is no, strategic intent. We go beyond that. We subsidize beyond what is necessary. And so, it's still the U shape, but it takes on the current policy politics into consideration and shed light on what to expect if they do engage in this kind of behavior.
Right. So I think that's interesting, and we should take a look at that. And so if so we have that curve for the China, but we should look at the effect on the US, or we should plot that curve and see what that is. That'll be very interesting to find out. But I think eventually, what this points out is that we really need a dynamic model. I think that's I think the scale effect is unambiguous. So when you have industrial policy, you increase your scale, and when you impose tariffs on high-tech, you reduce your enemy scale or the trading partner scale, and that seems to me is what they talk about the strategic competitions, and it seems that I feel that probably a more a better way to evaluate that is having a dynamic model. But can I try to finish it?
Xiaodong, sorry, can you spend 1 minute to wrap up?
Yes. So I just, one thing I want to mention is that this scale economy is important. For example, without scale economy, with standard Caliendo parallel model, then China's subsidy, so this is kind of parallel with no economy of scales, right? So China subsidy no longer benefit itself. So subsidy doesn't make sense at all, right? So the economy of scale is motivating the subsidy, but the effects on US still there. So even without, that's because China is producing intermediate input. So when China subsidy still have positive effects on the US. So that effect is independent of the scale effects. And so let me just, then we did the national equilibrium. We find the national equilibrium actually quite close to the 5%. So when we allow the strategic interactions of US tariffs and China subsidies, and US tariff is basically we have the same schedule as the Trump tariffs. We don't change, just reduce dimensionality, but say how large the tariff equilibrium. So it will be only 4% higher tariff. And China subsidy very close to the optimal, unilateral optimal 5%. Okay. So then we will also look at the other effects, as I mentioned, I don't have time to talk about, is that the effects on other economy is that Brazil and India will gain and Japan will always lose. And also when we look at the further retaliation and of the escalation of the trade war, in that case, what we find that both China and US loses. That's, as I mentioned in the introduction. So let me conclude, given the time constraint. So I think what we find here is that the scale effect is actually quite important, and into thinking about industrial policy. I mean, maybe it's not surprisingly, but I think that this shows that when we think about trade, given the US trade war is motivated by the China's subsidy policies, now we should take that into consideration when we evaluate these trade policies. But the industrial policy of China and the Trump tariffs unambiguously will have the scale effects unambiguous. So subsidy by China will increase Chinese high-tech scale, and the Trumpian tariffs will reduce Chinese high-tech scale. So I think probably that's what the competition is. And therefore, I think this point of the direction of future research is really have a dynamic model, thinking about how scale affect the future productivities overall, and therefore have an effect on welfare as well. So I'll end here.
Okay, thanks very much. You can carry on the discussion in the remaining 10 minutes break, and we will restart the talk at 11 a.m. Singapore time.
It's going to be, and actually the Trump tariffs are close to the national.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So Xiaodong, so one feature that's not currently in your model that might be worth thinking is, you look at the way Chinese government describes the trade war. They talk about the so-called 卡脖子行业, cutthroat. I don't know what the right translation is. So so there's a notion that certain imported inputs or certain exported, certain sectors have indispensable role in the production chain than others.
Yeah.
So that requires, and then and then you have then even in the absence of a scale economy, you want to develop, you want to subsidize just to make sure there's there's enough home country production for that.
Yeah.
So I mean, it requires some way to make a guess about how indispensable that is. I think the current import table may be too coarse to allow one to make that kind of the distinctions.
Yeah, so I mean, that's what we originally want to do, but the problem is that we don't have that disaggregated data.
But you have the width data allow you to do the following thing. Like you can look at Chinese imports from those, for all the Chinese imports from US, sort them by how important US is in the global exports. So those products for which the US is the number one, number two, maybe essentially the only supply or nearly only supply, this will be classified as 卡脖子 in the product. Then these are products presumably China.
Right, we can assume that, and then we assume some kind of Liang chip or something. But
the other way to do this is to look at the media reports. There's a small list of products that, they get those kind of labels. Then you say,
right.
Regardless of the production function features, we're going to subsidize that kind of productions.
Right. So that's So I totally agree, but I don't think it can easily incorporate into the current framework. So then we need a much more granular model for trade. Right?
Economically, the question is really how do you define what is 卡脖子 component?
I think it's just the things coming from the US, they have no alternative suppliers.
No alternative.
Yeah, it is really about, I think that there are several components. A,
and high tech.
You have monopoly. Number two, dynamically, it takes a lot of time to replace. And number three, when you don't have it, you really will die. And as a matter of fact, if China doesn't have all the super chips, it still will not die. So I think
the phones will run more slowly. It won't die. The phones will run more slowly.
Some kind of O-ring type of,
which is equivalent to dying.
I think you raise a very, very interesting point. But how do we define? And this 卡脖子 is being discussed a lot. But how do we actually define it is a question.
But there's also there's a mirror image of that question. Is that some people say, I was talking to Dan Traveler. He said that the impact of Huawei, for example, on the West is the standard model doesn't capture that, because Huawei now is just one extra and cheaper varieties. So you should only increase the welfare of the West. There's no reason for them to do it. But on the other hand, he thinks if Huawei is so competitive, then you will displace Nokia and displace all the similar high techs, and then but the quality is lower, and so in that, how do you capture that welfare effect? So now you end up with a lower quality version of those telecommunication equipment, and it's such that you will dominate the market in the West, and so that the other ones just cannot compete. But they may have higher quality, and then your variety does not necessarily increase. But again, but those are very interesting. But I think it's beyond this model, right?
No, I mean, even more complicated. This is not just economic issues, right? If you think about political economy, it's far beyond, like any of the simple model can capture. So you have to think about,
I think one way to
think about the role lobbyists play, right? If you think about a framework of like Grossman-Halperman, the result could be very, very different from, like Harry Johnson type of stuff.
But maybe, Ping, maybe one way to deal with this is to attach a component in the policy policymakers' objective function, like I'm happy if I have production, something like that. So it's politics, not economics. So you just change the preference function.
Yep, political economists have tried those kind of stuff. Very different from trade economists, actually. And the findings are also very different.
The good thing about doing that is that you can show the economic price of those come from nowhere political preference, and that would be beautiful.
Right.
Oh.
I mean, I guess, but I guess the question is, are there economic justifications to begin with, so that we don't bias those political preferences, right? So maybe, as maybe there was something mentioned about this complementarity, justify for some of the policies, even economically, without the, and then when you control for that, then you're looking at the political preference. I'm sure political preference matters.
Only 3 minutes. Oh boy, quick break.
Well, thanks a lot for very good question and suggestions.